Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about A Love Bazaar, the Minneapolis Sound Meets Rap, and Krush Groove. I think it's going to dovetail great with the first panel that we saw. So, like most reformed journalists, I actually have a Substack titled This Thing Called Life. I wouldn't go look for it because there's nothing on it yet. And I've been trying to figure out how to start that. And I often write at the intersection of music, politics, and culture because the three are connected to my freedom as a woman and as an African American. And I was driving in my car listening to news, and person A called person B evil while being evil. And so, because I think in musical lyrics, I'm screaming at my car radio, Little Wayne lyrics, what's a goon to a goblin? And I'm like, turned the channel, and there was a Love Bazaar playing. And I realized that maybe the answer isn't a Prince song, and it was, but they play a Love Bazaar every day on the Groove on Sirius XM. And so I saw how my thinking evolved from this one musical question to this other possibility that there's an answer to my musical question in another song. And just like my thinking evolved, music is constantly evolving too. And it's an evolution that's shaped by cultural shifts, technological advances, and creative impulses of artists who dare to push boundaries. So the evolution is not just about changing sounds, but it's also about how genres blend, intersect, and give birth to entirely new styles. So in the mid 1980s, one of the most exciting movements of this evolution, of course, was the emergence of the Minneapolis Sound, which itself was a genre bending fusion of funk, soul, rock, pop, and other genres of music that basically operated separately. And we see this new wave kind of music in in the music of Prince and his collaborators. And what we take for granted now is being kind of a genre fluidity, because we always talk about gender too with that word. But it was once considered groundbreaking. And we find this amalgamation of sounds um, happening in other genres and the emergence of uh, genre blending in the 80s and 90s. But this particular one that incorporates both the Minneapolis sound and hip hop, which was entering its golden era in 1985, can be found in the film Krush Groove. So A Love Bazaar wasn't just a hit song, it was a cultural marker where you had these emerging aesthetics combining Minneapolis sound and hip hop. They're colliding. The track's inclusion, A Love Bazaar, in the early hip hop film A Krush Groove was a definitive representation of genres merging. It was really a glimpse into um, what the future of music could sound like. And what we have here is Black music arriving in a way that it hadn't before. And the film itself showcased artists that would go on to become legends in music. So this track in the film is so deeply rooted in hip hop culture was really a testament to the blurring of boundaries, setting the stage for cross genre experimentation in Black music, where you see these 80s and 90s hip hop R&B collaborations happening. So the presence of a Love Bazaar in this hip hop space was was an anomaly at the time, considering that this film predominantly featured rap and hip hop artists like Run DMC, LL Cool J, and the Fat Boys. But this song by Sheila E. and Prince pretty much fits kind of seamlessly in this world. And while the track didn't contain, the soundtrack contained other non-hip hop artists like Shaka Khan, um, with her cover of I Feel For You, which contained a rap by Melly Mel of the Furious Five, and a sample of Stevie Wonder's Fingertips. While that sampled artist also played the harmonica feature in the song, which is a very hip hop thing to do, Krush Groove was a moment for hip hop's mainstream visibility. And by featuring a Love Bazaar alongside these rap tracks in the film and even though the song's not on the soundtrack, if you expand the score of the film, um, this signals that funk, R&B, and hip hop are no longer operating in separate spaces. There's this combination of happenstance that foreshadows what would emerge in the late 80s, a deliberate fusion of R&B and hip hop that would eventually become known as New Jack Swing, which itself had distinctive sounds from producers like Teddy Riley, Babyface and L.A. Reid, Jimmy Jam, and Terry Lewis. So this hybrid sound becomes a favorite of Black and Brown Gen Xers who were coming of age at the time that Krush Groove was released. And by the 1990s, you have artists like Lauryn Hill, Mary J. Blige, Mariah Carey, and Pick a Rapper that are blending and further blurring these lines between R&B and rap. And so it also then goes beyond New Jack Swing and goes into what we now refer to as hip hop soul. So the song "A Love Bazaar" itself really exemplified how Prince and his proteges were kind of reshaping a landscape ahead of its time because it was included in the movie. If you take it at that value, um, of course, by itself, you wouldn't get that. But the inclusion of the movie, I think, does make a significant shift in how we look at how music has evolved. So in 1985, the Minneapolis Sound fully materialized. It's evident not just in Prince's projects, but the projects for other artists like The Time, Vanity Six, Apollonia Six, The Family, and of course Sheila E. And by the many attempts of other artists who wanted to emulate and copy the sound itself. But that sound too was still evolving. So even though it was explosive, and with Love Bizarre, Prince and Sheila E. didn't just deliver a funk anthem. We have to say that they kind of created a sonic blueprint for what this future of music will kind of look like with the hip hop breakbeats and this sound of R&B singing on top of that. So the song's deep percussive groove, the syncopated drum programming, this minimalist yet really hypnotic bass line kind of foreshadows how hip hop would embrace funk samples, looping them into breakbeats that would become the foundation of this entirely new sound. And if you think about it, by the mid 1980s, hip hop was still defining itself. It was still heavily indebted, the earliest rap records were heavily indebted to funk and disco, built from um, built from samples by artists like James Brown, Parliament Funkadelic, and anything produced by Nile Rodgers at the time. And with a song like A Love Bazaar, you start to hear something different, but with this same vein, something more stripped down, more percussive, more driven, a bass and beat that's really driven. And it's a sound that feels kind of like the connective tissue between R&B, funk in the past and hip hop's future. So to truly understand A Love Bazaar and its place in this musical evolution, we have to start with the backbone of the track, which is the percussion. And Sheila E. is not just a singer, band leader. She's one of the most skilled percussionists in music. And to be born into a family of musicians, she was already an accomplished drummer and percussionist long before she linked up with Prince, as Chris mentioned in his presentation. And her mastery of rhythm, particularly her ability to fuse Latin percussion with funk, made her kind of the perfect collaborator to help push the Minneapolis sound further. And Prince was a man who was obsessed with rhythm. He understood the power of percussion in a way that few pop artists did at the time. And in the early 80s, he found that new weapon, the Lynn drum machine. And if you listen to La Bazaar, there's that unmistakable hard hitting drum sound, these sharp snares, deep gated kicks, precisely programmed rhythms. That's the work of the Lim drum. And Prince used the Lin to create a mechanical, hypnotic groove, while Sheila E.'s live percussion added a human warmth to the song, creating a blend that felt simultaneously futuristic and deeply rooted in funk's rhythmic tradition. And this emphasis was something that hip hop artists had already begun to experiment with as well. So by the time Allah Bazaar hits, hip hop producers and DJs are embracing drum machines like the Roland TR-808. That's why when you hear hip hop artists say 808, they're talking about adding that. The Lin, they started to build their beats, layering them over sampled grooves. And the fact that Allah Bazaar fit into this sonic landscape because of its presence in the film, you have to wonder if it was a coincidence or was it really a sign of how connected these musical movements were becoming. So while not a rap song in the traditional sense, um, its rhythmic delivery, repetitive hooks, and funk-driven beat structure align with the audible textures in hip hop. And so integrating this technology with live instrumentation, most notably Sheila E's percussion work, the song bridges this gap between the two. Another defining characteristic of the song is really its repetitive hypnotic groove, as I mentioned before, but the way that it mirrors a loop, the loop production style that's dominant in hip hop. So, in many ways, the song functions like I said, an extended breakbeat, allowing for dance driven improvisation, something that early hip hop DJs and breakdancers and MCs valued in tracks they selected for parties, freestyles, and battles. And also, too, Prince and Sheila E's vocal cadence echoes the interplay between MCs and hype men in hip hop performances as well, where you have Sheila E, her voice and her vocals landing directly on the beat, but Prince's vocal is slightly behind, about an eighth of a beat, creating this echo effect that is reminiscent of hype men like Flavor Flav from Public Enemy and Freaky Todd, the Lost Boys, and countless other hip hop producers, particularly between 94 and 2000, who used this vocal layering style to add depth and energy to the tracks. And perhaps most significantly, I think, is the inclusion of this moment of musical intersectionality is the film's emergence in the establishment of Def Jam Records, which is really what the film is about. It also acknowledges the fact that alongside Sheila E being alongside these Rush management artists, and if you remember anything about Def Jam, all the artists were managed by Rush management. It not only reinforces the idea that hip hop wasn't just a standalone movement, but it was really a continuation and reinvention of Black musical traditions, the same way the Minneapolis Sound was. And even though Prince himself was initially reluctant to embrace hip hop, Allah Bazaar inadvertently positioned this sound within that movement's orbit. So we look at a few years later, and we see this new hybrid sound emerging in full force. Um, Not just New Jack Swing with artists like Guy and Keith Sweat, Teddy Riley coincidentally cites Prince as his influence and gets his start producing hip hop with the show by Dougie Fresh and Slick Rick. And as you know, Doug goes on to work with Prince in the late 90s. But New Jack Swing, too, like this situation of Allah Bazaar and Krush Groove is also a cultural moment where the lines between rap and R&B blur again. And then the collaborations between rappers and singers becomes solidified. You see it very often. Like I said, name a rapper Mariah Carey has not worked with. But these aren't just guest appearances by this point, they're also full fledged duets, which brings me back to a Love Bazaar, which operates kind of like a duet. So this fusion gives rise to anthems that resonate across the Black experience and in house parties in high schools, on MTV rotations. And it wasn't just the music, it was the culture, the fashion, the swagger, and the way that it redefined what popular music could be. And the video for A Love Bazaar gives us a video transition from the performance sequences, with the performance sequences of the film contained within it, but you also see two very distinct representations of masculinity coexisting here, with the aesthetic of the men in Sheila E.'s band juxtaposed with the gold chain wearing Adidas sneakers and Levi suit clad members of Run DMC. So as New Jack Swing gains momentum, we start to see where hip hop and R&B begin to dominate movie soundtracks in the 90s, just like Krush Groove did in 1985. And the shift wasn't just about the music, it was a reflection of a growing cultural impact of hip hop and R&B hybrids in defining this sound of an era. So some of the more influential films to carry this torch were House Party in 1990, which had Full Force, Flavor Flav, and other groups sitting there coexisting. Then there was New Jack City in 1991, It was a film that didn't just borrow from the New Jack Swing movement. It was the movement, and it it became as much the sound as it was the film. And in 1982, Boomerang, while not a hip hop movie, it was really a situation whereas you had R&B existing in hip hop films, here you have hip hop coming into a film where R&B is the centerpiece. And then later in that decade, there's Above the Rim, which really continued this trend. And that's where you get this soundtrack, though spearheaded by Death Row Records, which which is kind of an opposite telling of Krush Groove, if you will, um, in terms of how the soundtrack operates, not the film. You have Tupac on that soundtrack. You have Warren G, and then you have this R&B hip hop hybrid of anything the remix by SWV, which features Wu-Tang Clan, samples a song called Get Up and Dance by Freedom, samples Cream by Wu-Tang Clan, samples right here the Human Nature remix by SWV, but doesn't sample the original song anything, which is also a very hip hop thing to do. So these soundtracks weren't just marketing tools for films like Crush Group. They were a different phase of hip hop's relationship with R&B. And in the 2000s, we start to see that too with Love and Basketball, Brown Sugar, and that gives this collision of hip hop with neo soul to become something else, yet another hybrid. And so by the early 90s, New Jack Swing had laid this foundation for the next wave of R&B. Prince even dabbled in it himself when he did the song Round and Round with Tevin Campbell, which is considered a New Jack Swing song of the time. And then you also start to see more artists like Jodeci and SWV who carry more of a hip hop infused aesthetic in their R&B performances. So it started out as this experiment in blending genres, becomes a defining moment in Black music, setting the stage for the future of R&B and its ongoing relationship. And much like the Minneapolis sound itself exists in a similar space with outside of popular music and outside of R&B, but also within it. I think the song Allah Bazaar sits the same way in hip hop and its ties to hip hop. It's undeniably funk um, with a rhythm structure that DJs and producers could later mine for inspiration. And there is a song that sampled it. I could not remember the name of the song, and I looked for who sampled it, but it is an independent song, so it's not on Who Sampled. But this deep pocket groove and the interplay of live and electronic instrumentation and the call and response vocal structure really hint at what's to come. And here's where it gets interesting. Just like hip hop includes samples, at minute 8 and 1 second in Love Bazaar, Prince plays an interpolation which is a replayed sample of Farah Jacques, the nursery rhyme. And just like just like Prince did there, you have Nas sampling Beethoven for I Can. And where Prince hated samples, he made good use of interpolation, which aren't hip hop loves a sample. And for example, he actually did an interpolation of a hip hop song in his remix for The Greatest Romance Ever Sold, which was a sample of another song. So it's this dynamic interplay of blending genres and sampling from here and taking from here and creating something different. So with the Love Bazaar, they did more than just create a hit song. They became part of a movement in Black music history where funk and R&B begin to absorb this raw energy and edge of hip hop and vice versa. And the movement shaped what would become two dominant sounds of the late 80s and early 90s. So when we listen to A Love Bazaar, we're not just hearing a hit single from 1985. We're hearing the sound of music in transition, a song that exists at the intersection of the past and the future, a song that embodies the fearless spirit of experimentation that defined Prince and his collaborators. And more importantly, we're witnessing a moment where artists begin to see musical genres as tools from which new musical art forms are created, where R&B, funk, and hip hop become part of the same conversation as opposed to separate but overlapping discussions. And Sheila E herself, of course, made her dive into hip hop with Holly Rock. Um, but I think it's more evident in the influence that this music, this Minneapolis sound has on hip hop, is to go and look at the songs that sampled Prince, like Tennessee by Arrested Development, No Delaying by Nice and Smooth, which was one of my favorites. Um, but you also have hip hop artists take a cue and work with artists outside of R&B. So there's Jay-Z working with Linkin Park. Of course, Run DMC, the year after Krush Groove, forming this collaboration with Aerosmith for Walk This Way. And though Prince was initially hesitant about hip hop, his influence can still be traced to the production techniques, performance styles, and cross genre collaborations. But hip hop had actually always been around Prince, just not in the form of hip hop. He'd worked with George Clinton, as I said, I mentioned, Shaka Khan. And George Clinton, aside from James Brown, who was one of Prince's favorite artists, they're two of the most sampled artists in hip hop history. So music never stays in one place, it's constantly moving. And if you listen to how the future and language, how future language could sound, it sounds something like this. If you speak fluent Prince in hip hop, and if you don't get the references, ask me about them after, and I'm glad to tell you. So, dig if you will, a funky mosaic at the corners of 38th East in Chicago, or on the Boulevard of Linden, where Paisley and graffiti meet. It's young, it's funky, fresh, dressed to impress, ready to party, adorned in lace with rhythm and revolution. It ain't just a love song, it's a prophecy, like philosophies wrapped in a drum beat with a guitar solo. And a DJ scratch crushes through the groove like it knew the future. Allah Bazaar's presence in Krush Groove was all of this, sharing the possibility of what the future of music could sound like. So if you're looking at the screen, you see Minneapolis Sound plus hip hop equals the future. To be continued. Thank you.